Hey everybody, it's Matt Weaver here with Bible Truth Project, and today we have a treat. We have Travis Snow, who is an author and somewhat of a Bible scholar, I guess, who is with us, is going to talk about his amazing books that he wrote. One of them is The Passover King, and the second one that just came out not that long ago is the 70 Weeks Jubilee. And I just finished digging through this one. So thank you so much, Travis, for agreeing to do this. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Appreciate you having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So one of the things that kind of intrigued me about you is it's not that often per se that I find somebody who's kind of in my age bracket who likes digging into this stuff. I mean, I know they're all over the place, but I just was intrigued that we're kind of in the same age bracket. So not that that has a whole lot of bearing on it, but that was a fascinating point for me. But I really have found out about you through Joel Richardson. I connected with him when we went to Saudi Arabia, and he had recommended the Passover King, which I purchased and read through, and it was really an amazing angle that I hadn't considered much. I've studied some eschatology, etc. At that point, I hadn't studied as much, but the last 2 years in the pandemic, etc., has given a lot of people a lot of extra time. So I've studied a lot more in it, and it was very interesting, the take that you brought out in that. So here at the beginning, I guess let's focus on this book first, and then we'll get into the 70 Weeks book. But what kind of was behind this one? What drove this? And tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So the basic premise of the book is that when Jesus comes back, the return of the Lord, the second coming, it's going to be kind of a prophetic replay, if you will, of the original Passover story. And there's a lot we could unpack there in terms of specifics, but kind of the old school conventional thinking on Passover is that it's already been fulfilled, at the cross. Jesus was most likely crucified on the day of Passover in the first century when the Jewish priestly class was sacrificing their lambs. And there's this whole Jesus as the sacrificial lamb idea that's very prevalent in Christianity today. It's been prevalent for thousands of years since the early church. But there's also this other side to Passover that is related to eschatology, as you mentioned, or the study of the end times, the return of Jesus. And when I started digging into this more and more in both the biblical texts in the Hebrew Bible, you have a lot of Old Testament texts that a lot of people aren't even familiar with. You have a lot of Old Testament texts that present the victorious appearance of the Messiah, because back then, they didn't always make a distinction between first and second coming. They were just presenting the Messiah appearing in glory,
Yep.
You have all these texts that kind of present it as a rehashing of the Exodus story and the Passover story. So the Messiah is this warrior. He's like a new Moses deliverer. He's coming back to deliver Israel, even says he'll come out of Egypt. There's passages that refer to the Messiah pouring out plagues of wrath that directly parallel the 10 plagues from the book of Exodus. So that idea, when I started kind of encountering it in different places, really just led me down this journey of research and all that. And you find that idea too in Jewish literature. It's very common, and it was very common in Jesus's own day too. A big passage I talk about is Luke 22, where Jesus says he will eat the Passover with us again when it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God. That's Luke 22, 15 to 16. So Jesus himself spoke of a future fulfillment of Passover, even beyond the cross. And it's just not a commonly held or known about idea, but it's there, and it's there in the book of Revelation as well. And I think at a practical level, I find that understanding the return of the Lord through the lens of Passover just helps so many different pieces of the eschatology puzzle fit together. And that was another thing that drew me to it, was just kind of seeing how it explains so many things, from the return of Jesus itself, kind of God's plan for Israel, what's going to be happening there, other kind of end time events related to the Antichrist. So I was kind of just trying to use that idea in Scripture to explore eschatology throughout the book.
Yeah, that's one of the threads. I want to say that probably the first time I really had heard of that concept was actually I had got a pre-published couple chapters of Joel Richardson's Zion to Sinai, or Sinai to Zion, however it is, Sinai to Zion.
Yeah.
And in there he mentions that whole Exodus the redone Exodus, I guess you would say. And I'm guessing he probably was inspired somewhat in the content of your book, and I don't know the history, so I'm not going to suppose, but I learned about that thread, and it was very intriguing to me because I hadn't really thought of it that way. You know, the stuff that I had heard about or was familiar with was the idea that the last days is going to be like Tabernacles, Sukkot, kind of fulfill that whole, you know, Yom Teruah all the way through that kind of reasoning. But then you actually made a tremendously compelling case that no, it is a Passover based model. And that was something that was different than what I understood. And I think it's helpful. You know, eschatology for a lot of people is maybe a little confusing. And so they don't want to approach it because there's a lot of opinions involved. But I've kind of found over the last few years, as I've kind of dug into it, that there are these common threads that most people agree on some base points or premises. And then there's some adjustments with timing and things like that. And obviously, you know, your position is definitely futurist, literal, not allegorical per se, return of Jesus to come and set up a kingdom. So I would assume you are premillennial.
Mm-hmm.
Totally, I don't know about pre-tribulational or pre-trib, but no, personally, I'm not. But I don't know where you stand. I mean, I know where you stand, but you know, you can't say that to the camera. But generally, I think we agree on that side of things. But in general, there's just that shift. So that's one of those things. Like for me, is okay. So in my mind, I kind of had this Tabernacles view of it, and it does fit to a degree. But then the Passover view really does actually fit very, very nicely. And the language you talked about, the coming out of Egypt, coming to Sinai, from Sinai coming up north, like it's really in the footsteps of the original Exodus, is kind of what the biblical narrative is kind of alluding to, especially from the Sinai north part. And you highlight that, which I think is really useful. And I think everyone really should, if they're interested in that sort of material, you're going to get a lot out of the book. One of the questions, excuse me, is just in your view. And I know you addressed this. I mean, these are thick books. There's a lot of pages. I know on Twitter you were lamenting over your page counts, but I'm
a glutton for punishment.
But in the just the timing, kind of how, I mean, maybe that's too much to ask, but what about just the rundown of kind of the timing events that you see in the final 7-year sequence, based upon what you see and what you studied in this book?
So that's a lot. I was going to also say, just to follow up with your comment about Joel Richardson, I think we were I know we were actually writing our books at the same time, completely unaware of each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Nice.
And so Joel is one of the only other people who's like bringing to the forefront this Exodus idea. And then we started talking through email, and then I kind of put it on his radar, and then he was doing Sinai to Zion. So we were pretty much doing it at the same time, which is really cool. And there were certain things that he had, certain pieces of the puzzle that I really hadn't thought about and hadn't really seen. And so he like put other things on my radar, even as I was writing the book, which was really cool. So I do think it's something that the Lord is bringing to the forefront, like you said, of just moving away from the fall feast idea of that the return of Jesus is only connected to Feast of Trumpets and Day of Atonement and Tabernacles. And what I emphasize, I think all of the biblical feasts, I think they kind of will go sequentially. I think they will all be fulfilled in some way in the future. Now, in terms of your question about 7 years, are you talking about like the start of the 70th week, or you talk like the tribulation, quote unquote, or more like when Jesus actually comes back, like the sequencing, or all of the above?
Well, maybe we should rephrase it. So maybe instead of just from because I know the 70 weeks, you get into that part a little bit more, and we'll probably touch base in that a little bit later. But from the Passover King perspective, just walk us briefly through kind of the steps that you saw in Scripture of his arrival, et cetera, from the context of that
Oh,
book, the Passover King.
yeah. So I think, first of all, the big question is, where does Jesus actually come back to? So when he descends from heaven, and let's just leave the rapture out of it for the time being. I have some chapters on the rapture at the end of the book that incorporate the rapture more, but for now, I'll kind of leave that on the back burner. So Jesus is coming out of the clouds. He's coming in glory, and he has gathered his saints. And the question is, well, where does he go? And for a while, or I think if you were to ask a lot of people, even premillennial type people, they might say he kind of descends to Jerusalem right away. The whole Zechariah 14, I think it's 14, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. So you have this idea that the Messiah will be in Jerusalem, and I don't doubt that, but there are other texts that seem to indicate that he's going to actually go down into the Middle East first. And I think a strong case can be made that when Jesus comes back, very early on, he will go down into Egypt because of the events of the Great Tribulation and the time of Jacob's trouble, which will scatter Israel, or a lot of Israel, out of their land. So the Jews will be scattered in exile again, in slavery and bondage to the Antichrist to some degree. And then Jesus is going to actually go and set them free. And there are so many passages that talk about the Messiah coming back to deliver Israel from slavery and to actually bring them back to the land. So I think, as you mentioned, it's kind of a natural sequence where he goes into Egypt and he goes across the Middle East, down through, what would we call it, the Sinai Peninsula, into where I think I agree with you, Mount Sinai. It's probably in Saudi Arabia. So I think he's going from Egypt over across to Mount Sinai, and then marching north from Mount Sinai up into the land of Israel, and bringing all of these captive Jews who he'll be regathering with him up to the land and up into Jerusalem. And then it seems like at some point around that time, you're talking like after he's come back, like the late stages of that final 7-year period as you're transitioning, it seems like he will encounter the Antichrist in the land of Israel, and that there will be this final great battle that takes place. A lot of people know that as the Battle of Armageddon, quote unquote. And John in the book of Revelation uses a lot of Passover symbolism in Revelation 15 and 16 when he's talking about the Battle of Armageddon and these final plague judgments. So I think that's kind of the sequence, that Jesus is this Passover warrior king, and he's marching through the Middle East. You have passages like Isaiah, is it 61 or 63? I forget. Talks about the Messiah coming out of Edom, which would have been Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So that's kind of like, again, him coming from the south. Just talks about him marching north. And so I think that whole motif of this exodus out of Egypt up through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, into the land of Israel, where he will finally encounter the Antichrist, that's kind of the way I view it going down before he sets up the kingdom.
Yep. I think just a question, I guess, like, and you don't really get into this a whole lot per se, but it's just a question. Do you you tend to connect Gog Magog as with the final conflict as well? That's correct. Like that's
Yes.
kind of synonymous with Armageddon.
Yes, I have in that Passover book, I think it's 4 chapters on Gog Magog. So I view Gog Magog in Ezekiel 38 to 39 as one of these central end times or eschatological Passover texts. And I try to really lay out in the book how Ezekiel is using this Passover language that he's actually drawing from the Torah in different passages, especially Numbers 24 and Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah.
So I really try to highlight how Ezekiel is presenting the Gog of Magog war as this final culmination point where the Antichrist is defeated. So I believe Gog is the Antichrist who's defeated before the Messianic kingdom, right when Jesus comes back. Totally, yeah.
Awesome. So the role of Messiah, I guess one of the questions, and I think you're probably in the same pages with me on this side of it, and that is the Jewish nature and identity of the Messiah in Jesus. It's something that I think in the Christian world, unfortunately, I think it's changing some. People are understanding more the Jewish roots of the faith per se. But as far as in general, a lot of people have kind of forgotten what it actually means to be a Messiah, that was a Jewish concept. Well, I shouldn't say Jewish, it was God's concept, but it was a Jewish concept, Jewish identity. There's a lot connected to that. Do you look at this like in the picture of this book, and I'm going to bring it up probably in the latter book as well, but just where does the church fit into this whole situation? Because I tend to see a lot of the Old Testament texts, etc. It really focuses around Israel. God is focused around Israel. The things that God's going to bring fulfillment is surrounding Israel and with Israel and through Israel, etc. So where does the Gentile, the Goyim, where do they fit into this picture in your mind?
Yeah, generally, I think that's the interesting thing, is how much focus is on Israel. And then if you have all these passages in the Old Testament, you would have to put Israel at the center. But then as you get into the New Testament, I think to some degree, although I don't believe the church replaces Israel, they are kind of incorporated into the story, kind of grafted into the covenant, into the new covenant. And Paul talks about being kind of part of the commonwealth of Israel. So I definitely think we have a major role to play. The church has a major role to play. And a lot of what Israel experiences, especially in the end, in terms of persecution and anti-Semitism, I think that will kind of go both ways in terms of the church standing in solidarity with Israel will be brought into Israel's experience to a very large degree. And that's also a big part of my ministry, is just helping the church understand God's plan for Israel and how everything will unfold so we can be prepared whenever these things happen, whatever the timing is. So I definitely think we're brought into it, and in a very major way, but not to the degree that everything that applies to Israel applies to us. I still keep some distinction there. Yep. And I think that's a distinction that you see even throughout the New Testament.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I would have, before my exposure, and look, I'm not, I don't have the years of schooling from the academic standpoint for it, but just my practical trips to Israel, time that I spent around the material, etc. My eyes opened so much to the, I guess, how would you say it? The Middle East centric, Jewish centric, Israel centric nature of Scripture, and not only that, but of the faith. If you're there wasn't really a term or a word for Abrahamic faith, even up through the Second Temple. It didn't really exist. They weren't necessarily known. It wasn't known as Judaism. The practice wasn't known as Judaism until later. It was just basically Israelite or Hebrew faith. That's kind of all it was. And I think it's interesting that it's in that context of faith that we enter this kind of messianic time frame, or in the Second Temple period, where you have a lot of messianic movements. And Yeshua, Jesus's movement, was another one of these. And that conversation by the Sanhedrin, Gamliel stands up and talks about look, this is another movement. If this is from God, there's nothing we can do about it. It's not going to change anything. But if it's not from God, this thing's going to fall apart like all the others did. And I think it's pretty interesting that a sage like Gamliel, who's the grandson of Hillel, makes a statement like that, that if this is of God, it's not going to fall apart. And of course, we know history and everything connected to it. But that is really the divergence. That is the start of this movement. And of course, then 100 some odd years later, then you have the formalization of Judaism, et cetera, outside of the temple context. But still, as Christians, we have to understand that God's heart is for his people. Jesus, obviously is the creator of the universe, but he became part of the Israelite nation, specifically Judah, and put on the flesh of Judah and became part of that. And he's planning on retaining that. That doesn't go away in the prophetic understanding of scripture. Anyway, so Passover King, of course, is the title of that one. Highly recommend everyone to get this book. It really is an eye-opener. It has a lot of tremendous material in it, and it's exceptional. Is there anything else you want to add on with this book before we get into your latest one?
Well, I just really what you said about Jesus retaining his Jewish identity. It's something that I think is highlighted in the book to a large degree, but I think a lot of people they're kind of used to seeing Jesus as a Jew as like some New Testament background, like the history, like Jesus was a Jew and he was born in Bethlehem and we have Christmas and all that. But they don't make the connection that he still has Jewish flesh. He still identifies first and foremost with his people, with his culture, with his land, and that's never going to change. So when he comes back, the nature of everything he does is going to be so deeply embedded within that Jewish framework. And I think that even ties in right to the whole Passover thing of, from a Jewish point of view, from an Old Testament point of view, Passover is like the main celebration. It's the main pivot point in the Old Testament story, or it's one of the main pivot points. So it's so deeply ingrained into the consciousness of Jews and within Judaism. And so the idea that the Messiah is coming back to fulfill Passover, like this is just a very Jewish idea. And in my book, I actually talk about some of the Jewish sources, even modern rabbinic sources where you still see this idea. It's like very well accepted and commonly accepted among religious Jews today that the Messiah is coming back as this kind of Passover type Exodus, new Moses, because that's just who he is. But it's not so much understood in a lot of Christian context. But yeah, so that's probably my concluding thoughts on that book.
And then you went for the probably most difficult subject you could have grasped, which was Daniel 9, 24 through 27, the 70 weeks thing, and decided to write a book about it. And that's what this is all about.
Yep.
Which is quite intriguing. I just got
I was getting into Daniel 9. Sorry, I was getting into Daniel 9 when I wrote the first one, and I was like, man, I have so much material on this. I was like, I could just do another book on this. And yeah, it ended up being a pretty exhausting, extensive project, but I wanted to get it done. So yeah, there it is.
350 pages, if I recall. No, not quite. You're short. 354, you're just over.
Yeah.
Look at that. No, so let's talk a little bit about this. So Daniel 9 is a section of, maybe I should just pull it up real quick and read it. That'll be beneficial to everyone listening here. All right, here it is. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the wrongdoing, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with streets and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come the one who makes desolate until a complete destruction. One that is decreed gushes forth on the one who makes desolate.
Simple.
Very simple.
Oh, yeah.
So what and we could go, I don't know how many different directions on it, but you like why pick this to then read a book? I mean it's an amazing section of scripture because it contains a lot of information that in some ways isn't really anywhere else in scripture, especially to do with timings, and some of the things that the Messiah, the Prince, I mean, the references there. It's pretty rare to find kind of a loaded scripture like this. But yeah, I guess take us through some of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it is totally loaded. And I think one of the benefits of it, I think that is one of the benefits of it, is that it's totally loaded. And so if you can get it right, it just unlocks a lot of things. Because you're talking about the debate between even, is it messianic or not? So Orthodox Jews don't think it today. Orthodox Jews don't think it's messianic, whereas I would argue that it is. Then you have the whole debate between preterists who think it was fulfilled either during the time of the Maccabees or in the first century in 70 AD, versus futurists like you and me who say it still has a future fulfillment, especially the last 7 years. And then you have the whole issue of Israel in the prophecy. Does this refer to some kind of future for Israel during the end times and in the kingdom? Or was God kind of done with that in the past? So you have all these, like you say, kind of loaded issues. And that's why I think it's so beneficial, because once you work through all of that, you get a lot deeper insight and understanding into the Messiah and what it says about him and when he would come and what he would do. You get insight into things about the future. And there's just so much there that I felt like there hasn't really been a book that fully unpacks it in the way that I think it should be unpacked. There's been a lot of commentaries and there's been some shorter books, but I don't think anyone's really done it justice in a long time, at least, or fully explored it, especially in relationship to the Jubilee. That's why I called the book the 70 Weeks Jubilee. So I just felt like there was so much there on Daniel 9 that needed to be said and fully worked through so that people would have a comprehensive resource. And yeah, I was kind of drawn to it for that reason, because of it's so power packed with so much important information that it just gives you kind of a foundation and a framework for I'm not going to say everything, but so many core vital issues that I think need to be on our radar.
Just in a basic context, basically, you would probably hold to basically the kind of, in a way, the I shouldn't say traditional, because I'm not sure if it is traditional, the 490, is that correct? No.
It's for 490 years total.
Yeah, 490 years total, based on the 40 or 449 if you're talking about a actual Jubilee, but 490 is the large form Jubilee.
Yes.
And that is basically some of the time that we have in the 62. I'm trying to read it and think at the same time. Sorry, but that's coming from the 62. Is that correct?
Well,
or 69 weeks.
Yeah, so you have the 70 weeks, which is Shavuim Shavim in Hebrew, which corresponds to the
Shavua is 7.
Yeah, the 7, but the cycles of the Jubilee. So the 70 weeks is like 10 Jubilee cycles. So it's basically 70 times 7 or 10 times 49. And that's how a lot of early Jewish commentators were reading it, as a period of jubilees that's leading up to the Messianic age, because who's going to ultimately fulfill the Jubilee? Well, the Messiah. So, but then what happens in the prophecy is almost all of those pass by. 483 years is the first 69 weeks, which is the 7 and 62 of verse 25. And then you have 7 years, or one kind of 7-year cycle that hasn't come to pass yet, because the other period got cut off right before the Messiah was crucified. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And in the book, I lay out all different charts of just how different people interpret the timeline. And that's another thing I wanted to do for people, was just kind of say, here's how this group interprets it in visual form. Like, here's their chart of where the years are, and the 7 and the 62. And yeah, so I get into all that, but it's definitely kind of riffing off of this idea of Jubilee cycles because of the prophetic significance of that.
And a Jubilee basically in the Old Testament was the 49th or the 50th year, where it was you have the concept of the Shemitah, but it's the ultimate Shemitah of a generation, where things go back to original tribal territories, et cetera, for people's inheritances, et cetera. Slaves are set free, debts are canceled. And you get into some of that as well, of the fulfillment of the Messiah in coming, first of all, the righteousness aspect, et cetera, but then also looking forward to when he comes back. It's interesting that one of the first things that happens in prophecy is that he actually gives people their inheritances. Like, there's again that idea of, okay, we're putting people back into the land, back into their inheritances, kind of following the same pattern. So I again, it was very helpful to see those connections as well. Of course, I've been familiar with the passage, et cetera, but it is tricky. I've heard different things. One of the things, and I just, one of the things I've heard from different people is the idea that the 70 weeks was literally a 70-week ministry of the Messiah. Have you ever heard of that concept before?
Yeah, that's the first century preterist view. They'll say the 70th week was from 27 to 34 AD. That's kind of a general timeline that they'll use, a lot of them. So they'll say the Messiah started his ministry in 27 AD, which I think is highly possible. And then, they'll end. So then they'll add their 7 years to that, and they'll try to place everything related to the 70th week in that time period from 27 to 34 AD. The problem is, it just doesn't work when you actually start looking at the passage and you start looking at the dates that they're using and everything that has to fit there. You just can't get everything to fit from 27 to 34 AD. So then what they have to do is they have to add on extra time after 34 AD to get to 70 AD, because that's where they're putting the abomination of desolation. So they're just like conveniently saying, oh yeah, the 70th week is from 27 to 34. It's all right there. And oh, by the way, we're just going to add on this extra 36 years so we can get our abomination of desolation in the time of the Romans and all that. But that just doesn't work for so many reasons. I mean, you look at what happened in the first century, you look at what Jesus says will happen when the abomination of desolation takes place. I have 2 chapters just on that. I mean, it just doesn't, to put the fulfillment of the 70th week in the first century, it just doesn't fit. Not to mention, again, that the Jubilee is an end times motif. It's about the future coming of the kingdom. It's about what the Messiah will do when he comes back, how he will fulfill the Jubilee, like you said, by bringing the tribes of Israel back to their inheritance, setting them free, which was what the Jubilee was about in a historical way, or at a historical level. So then as scripture moves along, the Jubilee becomes this prophetic symbol, just like Passover. The prophets are always drawing on these major historical institutions to give us a window into what happens when the Messiah sets up his kingdom. And so, yeah, to say that the Jubilee was fulfilled in the first century when the temple was destroyed and the Jews were largely, exiled and sent into slavery, it's like, it's the exact opposite of what the Jubilee stands for. So there's no way that a Jubilee prophecy can be completely fulfilled in the first century. Although I definitely think the prophecy does relate to the coming of the Messiah, his crucifixion. That doesn't mean it ends there. That just means it's part of it, is kind of the case I'm making in the book. But yeah, that's a common view. It's a very well entrenched view going back to the church fathers, that Daniel 9 was fulfilled in the first century. But yeah, it's not true. It's just not true.
Who is the people of the prince, in your view?
Yeah, this is a good question. In my view, the people of the prince are the people who will invade Jerusalem with the Antichrist in the future. So I have a whole chapter on that too, where I talk about the people of the prince to come and the identity of the prince to come. And there's been a common view that the people of the prince to come were like the Romans, or even that it's revealing like the ethnicity or nationality of the Antichrist.
Yep.
That really goes back to Hal Lindsey, from the 1970s.
Late great planet Earth.
Yeah, he really popularized that view that Daniel 9:26 reveals the ethnicity and nationality of the Antichrist. But I think a stronger case, based on the Hebrew wording and that phrase, I think a stronger case can be that it's just referring to when the Antichrist invades in the future. I don't even think that verse is about 70 AD at all, which puts me in a minority of commentators. But I mean, people can read the book. I go through it. If you look at the language used there, it's all end times language that even corresponds back to Daniel chapter 8. So I think the people of the prince are that's the Antichrist invading Jerusalem in the future. Yeah, I think it's a general statement.
And then we come just keeping going down, the whole firm covenant for a week. What do you see that? How do you see that playing out?
I think that's referring to the prince to come, who would be the little horn from Daniel chapter 8, who would be AKA the Antichrist. I think that's referring to him making some kind of geopolitical covenant or treaty. And really, there's a lot of background I get into the book on this topic of how the Torah prohibited Israel from making covenants with the surrounding Gentile nations. Mm-hmm. And there's this passage, is it Isaiah 28, which talks about Israel making a covenant of death with the nations. And I think it's Daniel 9:27, the covenant is playing off of this idea that Israel will receive the Antichrist and make some kind of covenant with him for political gain, for peace, whatever. And then that will initiate the final 7 years of the 70th week. And then halfway through that, he will go back on his word, and he'll stop the sacrifices, which seems to me to indicate that the covenant could include some type of stipulation about sacrifices, maybe Jewish access to the Temple Mount. It's hard to say exactly, but at some point he breaks that covenant, and then he invades the city, which is what you see. I think that's exactly what you see in verse 26, and then other places like Zechariah 14, Ezekiel 38, kind of this final invasion of Israel before the Messianic age. I think that's all tying in. But what's cool about Daniel 9:27, it's actually telling us how this final 7-year period starts, which is the major value of the passage.
Yeah. And of course, the center point of verse 27 is the abomination reference, that you read about in chapter 11, as well as then Jesus references it in the Olivet Discourse, which to me is the strongest evidence that the book of Daniel in the mind of Jesus was not a fulfilled thing. And I know and I know in the traditional view, they struggle with like Daniel 11. They struggle with the details because it's kind of seems to fit what was going on between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. But I always looked at that and I'm just like, maybe it was kind of representative, but I don't know. For myself, I look at that as still all future. Maybe I'm weird, but I just somehow, when Jesus, he could have chosen a lot of scriptures, and he probably did in a lot of conversations we don't read about. But he could have chosen a lot of scriptures, but he kind of centered, and this is a point Joel has brought out, and a point Dalton has brought out, and there's a lot of others that have brought this out, and I think it is actually probably one of the most important aspects to understanding the last day sequence is the abomination, and how that is a anchor to understanding the time. That there's a lot of maybe different interpretations, things like that, and surrounding it from different viewpoints throughout generations. But the one thing that you cannot really argue with from any of the views is that if there's a temple standing, somebody goes up there, messes with the sacrifices, calls himself God, that's kind of clear. So, and then you have the Thessalonians reference to kind of that very thing, at least in the mind of Paul. And Paul wasn't at the Olivet Discourse. He didn't necessarily hear that from Jesus himself, but obviously the conversation in his day, his understanding, having gone back and forth with the apostles, was that very thing, that there's somebody going to go into the temple, sit down, and be God, and that there's this great rebellion, or I guess he uses the word rebellion there, that takes place. And that's an important thing to understand. And I think Jesus, makes that very clear in all of the, what can be interpreted many different ways of the Olivet Discourse. That's one anchor that's, I think, is extremely solid. That is very helpful, I believe. Just in your opinion, in Daniel 11, it's kind of off subject, but while we're on the subject anyway, Daniel 8:11, do you see all of that as future, or do you see just the last part of it of the little horn? I'm just curious.
So as of now, as I sit here in my living room, I will say this. It's hard for me to not see Daniel 8 as future. So I see Daniel 8 as future as of, Daniel 11 to me is actually the most complicated portion of the book of Daniel, which is ironic because a lot of people would say it's Daniel 9, like the 70 weeks. I actually think compared to the 70 weeks, I think Daniel 11 is way more complicated in terms of where you're starting your history and where you're starting your eschatology. What parts of that are past and what are future? That's a very, very difficult question, because Daniel 11 starts out historically in some way, it seems, talking about Alexander the Great. But then you could make the case, like I hear what you're saying, that a lot of that could be future, which kind of is connected to Daniel 8, in terms of the Daniel 8 war could be future between Turkey and Yavan, or I'm sorry, but Turkey is Yavan, between Turkey and Persia, Iran. And then you could argue that Daniel 11 is telling you kind of some of the things that happen after the war of Daniel 8, and I think in some way that's definitely true. That's definitely my position. So, but I feel a lot more confident about Daniel 8 in terms of what I believe and why. Whereas Daniel 11, in terms of when the eschatology part starts, is more complicated for me. And part of the reason for that is because to really get to the bottom of that, I mean, you would have to go and either spend a very long time studying the history of Alexander the Great and the breakup of his empire. And I've read a few books on this, but not enough to be like an authority to where I could say like every Seleucid king and this is exactly what happened. And even there are some commentators who say, yeah, the history doesn't exactly fit from Daniel 11 doesn't exactly fit everything, but I'm not an expert in that history to that level. So I think you'd have to really dig into a lot of sources and really kind of map out what happened after Alexander the Great. And that would probably reveal a lot about Daniel 11. So it's a big open question, but yeah, Daniel 8, it's a little more straightforward to me. It's hard, like, I don't know. I read Daniel 8 and I read the history of what happened after Alexander the Great died. And I read the language in Daniel 8 and I'm just like, this doesn't seem to fit. And one of the principles of interpretation I use is that if you're going to say something was fulfilled historically, you have to be able to show that all of the details were fulfilled historically. Because as you mentioned, they're patterns, they're historical patterns. And that's why people get tripped up on Daniel 9 in relation to 70 AD in the first century, because there are similarities between what happened in the first century and what Daniel 9 says, but it doesn't mean that all the details of Daniel 9 were fulfilled in the first century. So it's kind of more like a pattern than a true fulfillment. And I see the same thing with Daniel 8. There are definitely patterns in Daniel 8 with Alexander the Great and his empire falling and how Alexander the Great fought the Persians. But when I look at the details, I just don't see it being fulfilled back then. So
it's a little bit, I think something that we could use in today's language that people would understand is World War I and World War II. If from a historical context, if that happened in the first century or 600 year BC, whatever, there you have, in a space of several decades, a conflict that was in a lot of ways very similar. Similar players, similar locations, but different conflicts. And I think that kind of analogy could play true to where, there's been these shadow pictures that have existed that you could say, well, that could be it. But there's an ultimate fulfillment that will make sense when the time comes. And of course, you can't predict that. You just have to wait and see what happens. So,
yeah. It's complicated, and it comes back for me to the details, because I don't think God is trying to confuse us. And so if you look at something and you say, well, the details here just don't match history, I think we're on pretty solid ground to say this is about the future. That's how I approach those things. But I feel like there could be a lot more work done, even by scholars and historians, on Daniel 8 and 11. I'm in the process now of hopefully applying for PhD programs. I have to get through the GRE first, and I haven't had a math class since I was like 18. I'm 35 now. But I've been going back and forth on this of what to focus on in my PhD. And I've thought a lot about Daniel 8 and 11, but I don't know if that's going to be my focus or emphasis. But it's definitely something that I hope someone will do it eventually and like really dig into the scholarship there and the history and like the original source material from the Persians and all that. And afterwards the Greeks, because that's like an uncharted territory still in my mind. Totally. Yeah. I mean, it totally is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have one of the things I did. This is something I learned from not it's someone indirectly, but there's an individual, and I think I have a map here. Let me see if I do. The best biblical maps in the world, created by two individuals who lived in Israel for many years, Jim Munson and Stephen Lancaster. You can see the references there, biblical backgrounds. They actually live in Ohio, believe it or not. So they lived in Jerusalem for 30 years. And I was lucky enough to go to a seminar where Steve Lancaster gave a discussion. And those two men literally have walked every hill in Israel, this is back before the days of satellite, whatever. They used to walk every hill and take altimeter measurements and they physically drew out these maps, which are amazing. But anyway, but one of the things that they taught, Stephen Lancaster taught, is in something that they taught, and Stephen Lancaster was or Jim, both of them were professors at JUC for a long time, Jerusalem University College. And but one of the things they always did was draw things out, like when you see motions or movements or things, and just put it on geography so it makes more sense. And I actually did that. I'm not going to get into that in this discussion, but I actually did that with Daniel 11. And there is a absolute chronological flow to how all of those sequences go together. And so I kind of rendered it in a, if you will, scenes. Daniel's painting scenes, and in like act one of this scene, this happens and that happens and this happens and that happens, and then it kind of moves to a different scene, and then this happens and that happens and that. And when you do that, there's absolutely a chronological flow. And that's what convinced me. I went into I'm not exhaustive with the research, but just me studying and doing that is what convinced me that, this has to be future. It could have been fulfilled in the past, but it works. This whole thing just works. It actually flows like a perfect story and a picture of what's going to take place. But again, we don't know until it happens, but that's just my take on it. But yeah, you're completely right. Somebody should dig into it and do that, because it'd be interesting. So maybe you're the man. Maybe you should do that.
I don't know, to be totally honest with you, like I've been so much in the prophecy world now for years, and I continue to do it, and I will continue to do it. I don't plan on not teaching on prophecy, but I'm thinking of going more in the route of like church history, because I feel that there's so much there that I still want to learn about and study. And like, sometimes I'd rather like read about, the incarnation and justification and the Reformation and all these different church movements throughout history than go into like an academic setting and do like hardcore biblical studies with all these German scholars who are trying to rip the Bible apart. And
sure.
So from a professional standpoint, I'm not sure I want to like go quite that deep into the book of Daniel, but it'd be very intriguing and interesting. And I haven't fully like decided yet, but sometimes I'm like, I don't know if that's for me at that kind of level, but we'll see what happens.
Awesome. Well, I guess any final thoughts before we wrap this up? Is there anything that you'd want to discuss that we haven't touched on?
No, I feel like we're just scratching the surface here, man. I feel like we're just
let's keep going. Let's keep going.
I mean, it's whatever. I know you gotta be attuned to people's attention spans in the 21st century too.
I don't have to. Most people probably don't listen to the whole episode anyway. But if they can get bits and pieces, that's really the important part. And there's some people I know specifically, especially in our own congregation, that they'll listen to every last word and love it. But no, I mean, I understand these topics and subjects are so deep, and you can literally spend years discussing the ramifications. And I think that's somewhat what the Millennium is all about, where we can sit back in the culmination of the age and just take a breather. I really think that that's probably what's up, is we just take a kind of a divine breather and enjoy what God had in mind for this world before we enter an entirely new phase of life that we don't have a lot of information about. Mm-hmm. And I don't know at that point what God is planning on doing or what he has in mind, or that he has it planned. I think I was just thinking about it the other day. It's like, we think in terms of our lifespan, which, who knows, 70, 80, 90 years. But it's really not really how to think about it. You think about it, it's like the first century of our eternal existence, we were kind of relegated on this unfortunate earth and world and cursed world. But in that time that God made an opportunity for us, and just think from the mindset of now you're 500 or 600 years old looking back, how that idea, how that's going to change our perspective. When we look back in this time when we didn't have the clarity, we didn't see everything, we didn't know everything, but at the end, it's all going to work out. It's all going to make perfect sense. And we can contemplate. And I think that's, again, coming back to Millennium, that's really the purpose of it, is that we can take that time and contemplate and rejoice in what God did to bring humanity from the desperate situation that it was in. I mean, if you think about what Satan did in tricking the human race and tricking Adam, and it could have destroyed the entire human race. Mm-hmm. Yet God in his wisdom knew how to redeem. So, and we're part of that story. So I think, spending time with Jesus for 1,000 years, kind of in the honeymoon phase, is going to be unbelievable. Unbelievable. I can't wait to sit down and just hear some stories. Mm-hmm. Of course, we might do that in paradise until then, but I'm still thinking that some of that's going to be saved for when we get back.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's one thing too, is how tangible that experience is going to be, I think, with studying and eating and feasting and just living on a renewed earth is, that's really what it's all about. Yep. But yeah, and that's one of the reasons I think prophecy really does matter, and why I devote so much time to it, is because I think we're supposed, as much as we're supposed to hash out the details, we really are supposed to be grounded in the blessed hope of the kingdom. Like, that's supposed to be the engine that's sort of like driving everything for the community of faith, and so that's where I really think prophecy enters in. But then, yeah, like we're talking about, there's so many details of things that are laid out. Like, it seemed to me that God wanted to glorify himself by predicting the future, just by saying, like, look, I'm laying this out ahead of time. And some of it's very specific. And that's why I am a futurist, because I think if you don't have a future, futurist just meaning interpreting these prophecies as though they have a future fulfillment. If you're not a futurist, you're kind of taking that away from God, if that's even possible. Like, you're taking away from God his desire to glorify himself by specifically predicting future end time events. And yeah, so I think it's really important in that regard, because I think a lot of people are going to get saved in the future. A lot of people are going to come to faith because there's going to be prophecies being fulfilled. And it's going to be like Christians and Messianic Jews are going to be able to say, hey, like, look, this is in the Bible. Look at the 70th week. It's there. It's right there. It's happening. And that's why I think it's really important for us to be equipped in interpreting prophecy. And that's a big kind of part of what I'm trying to do with my ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I started this ministry called Voice of Messiah, which is how I basically publish my resources. We're actually in the process of hopefully changing our name, but I won't say what the name is going to be just yet until it's officially approved by the powers that be, So yeah, a big part of what we do is we publish the resources, teach on Bible prophecy. I'm also pretty active on Twitter. People can find me if they're on Twitter at Travis M. Snow.
Me too. I mean, I'm active following you, but that's
So yeah, so right now my ministry, it's basically like we're trying to produce resources that can help the church be more equipped in the study of prophecy. So I'll be publishing different things in the future. And then I also do some teaching, like when people ask me to speak. Just this last weekend, a friend of mine who has a Messianic congregation asked me to speak, so I'll do that. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of what I'm doing. I have another job as well, so I'm not doing all of this full time yet, but I hope to at some point. And yeah, trying to chart the course there, but that's awesome. The gist of it.
Awesome. Web address is, I believe it's back here. Is it voiceofmessiah.com or is it .org?
Yeah, it's .com. Voiceofmessiah.com.
Perfect. And of course, you can buy your books on Amazon, or I believe you have them available on your website as well.
Yeah, the links are there right now, mainly Amazon. Unless people wanted to buy in bulk, I could work with like a local printer, but most of what I do is through Amazon.
Sure. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Travis. I appreciate it. I appreciate the time, and I appreciate the energy. I know you have spent hours, and I wrote a book. It's not nearly this fat, and I understand a little bit of the kind of work that goes into doing something like this. So Lord bless you for it. And thank you so much, because I think it's a tremendous resource for us, especially in the last days, to have current thought on it. I know ancient thought is wonderful and great, but something applicable to what we're facing right now. What does it look like? So thank you so much for that, and blessings to you and your wife for putting up with all the hours where you've been busy.
Yeah, she's used to that at this point.
Yeah, my
But I
wife is
appreciate
too.
it.
She just rolls her eyes. She's like, another project? Like, really?
Yeah, my wife didn't even know I was working on a second book until I was like halfway done with that.
Ooh,
I don't know. I don't know how that happened, but yeah, she was
nice.
like, "You're working on another book?" I was like, "Yeah, it's halfway done."
Awesome.
But yeah, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate the conversation and what you're doing here as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Absolutely.